Hi, I'm Ashish, and today basically I'll be talking about case strategy and construction. That is, first of all, horrifically overbroad as a topic which I chose. So I guess I should clarify that most of what I'll be talking about right now is probably going to be mostly relevant to you if you are in opening half. I think some of the stuff will be relevant if you are doing extension, but largely I think it's going to be primarily relevant to you if you're in opening half. Another small caveat, everything I say here is from my own personal experience. This is what works for me. You might well find that all this stuff, it doesn't work for you at all, or you think it's flat out nonsense, in which case you're probably not wrong because I think people have different styles. So that being said, case strategy and construction. Before I go on to talk about, I think, specific tips which people should have when they're thinking about how to construct a case, what I want to do is that I want to talk about two kinds of cases, two kind of archetypal cases, which probably help you think a bit more clearly in prep about how you want to choose your strategy for that debate. Because very often people talk about how to come up with arguments or how to locate a clash, but often there's not so much talking about what kind of a case you are running and what the specific argumentative and strategic demands of that particular kind of case are. So one of these two archetypal cases, let's just call the first kind a type 1 case. A type 1 case, to simplify a bit, is basically a case where there's only one argument for your side. There really is nothing else. Or maybe there is other stuff, but it really is not at all persuasive. And people tend to panic when they're put in situations where they're basically supposed to run a type 1 case. Because what happens is that you go into prep, you've got 15 minutes, you're trying to think, oh God, we need to say a couple of arguments, and then you realize that you can't really go beyond the one obvious issue in the debate. And then people panic and run a suboptimal case. And type 1 cases are quite common, right? Often there are debates like, this house would ban violent video games, where honestly, there's only one real reason to ban violent video games. And it's that, they probably cause more violence in the real world in one form or another. So that's a type 1 case. A type 2 case, at the opposite end of the spectrum, is a case where you have multiple arguments and all of them on their own, even if the rest of the arguments were false, could win a debate. So a classic example of a type 2 case would be this house would legalize the sale and consumption of all drugs. A really strong argument on the proposition would be an argument to the effect that people are self-governing, they have autonomy over their bodies, and they should decide what substances they put in and out. And they have that absolute right. It's also an extremely powerful argument on proposition to say that the war on drugs has been a dismal failure and that a policy where a government allows for the sale and consumption of drugs but has some kind of intelligent regulatory mechanism will probably make the lives of lots of people consequentially much better. Now, if you run a case of both of these arguments, you are quite willing to accept that you might lose on one of them, but it doesn't really matter because as long as one of the arguments is true, you still win. A more extreme example of like a type 2 case will be something like this house believes that the language of instruction in all primary and secondary education in Africa ought to be English. Now, unlike the drugs case, you don't just have two winning arguments here. You probably have 6 or 7. You can make arguments purely about the educational benefits. You can make arguments purely about the benefits in terms of unifying disparate communities through a common language, which does not have to be chosen by the government from one of the pre-existing communities in the country, for instance. You could talk about the diplomatic benefits. You could talk about how this changes identity not only within nations, but across the entire continent. So there's a whole host of arguments you could run, and all of them could win. The reason why I want to open by talking about this spectrum, going all the way from a type 1 case to a type 2 case, is because knowing what kind of a case you are running will help you decide in prep what you need to defend and why you need to defend a particular claim. So for example, in a type 1 debate, what you often do, because you only have one argument, is that you break that one argument down into lots of separate, smaller claims, right? Like little lemmas, and you try and prove each of these, right? Turn each of these into individual arguments. Now, if you're running a case a type 1 case like that, you know that you need to defend every single link in that argument. Because if one of them fails, you will lose. That is the great risk of running a type 1 case. The benefit of running a type 1 case, on the other hand, is that it's really a very simple thing most of the time to make one argument and to make it really well. You can dedicate most of your prep time to figuring out how this argument should work. And so if I was to give you some advice on how you should run a type 1 case, if indeed you decide that that's the kind of case that you're going to run, the first thing to point out is that there's a very simple formula or structure you can use when you're running these cases. And that is to say, your first argument, or what you will call your first argument, really just sets out the criteria you want to judge the debate by, right? So for instance, if it's a debate about restricting some kind of expression or some kind of speech, your first point is probably going to be about when you think it's legitimate for a government to restrict speech or expression. If you are running a debate about government coercion and you are proposing a certain coercive mechanism, you probably want to say, we believe that these are the criteria which have to be fulfilled for a government to restrict the choices of free and rational individuals, well, of, free and rational kind of assumptions, right? So you might say that we believe that governments are entitled to intervene when there's a certain degree of third-party harm, when people are incapable of making a rational choice, depending on what particular definition of rationality you decide to take. And for a type 1 case, setting out your criteria is often extremely useful because often they help to clarify to the judge how even a clash which occurs late in the debate, in the closing half, for instance, ought to be adjudicated. And at the very least, it allows for a judge to say that you made some significant contribution to the debate, right? Because very often, teams in the closing half, or even team opposite you, won't really try to engage with your assertion of what criteria by which a debate should be judged are. And that actually gives you a very useful foothold. So sometimes the first point is just you setting up the criteria. Sometimes the first point, if it's not a debate where there's a sort of standard set of criteria you can use, sometimes the debate just involves you explaining what the problem is and what needs to be done for you to have considered to have won the debate, right? So if it's a debate about, which involves post-conflict states, for instance, you might want to say that in a post-conflict state, there are two overriding or two overwhelmingly important goals which we need to try and fulfill. The first is to persuade people in different communities to live together. The second is to persuade people that the institutions of democracy are the ways through which they should try and resolve their disputes, as opposed to violence, for instance. I think these are, it's quite a standard set of aims you'll want to have in any post-conflict state. And once you've set out that this is what your case is trying to achieve, then your second, third, fourth, fifth point, those are just going to be explanations, quite straightforward explanations of why those criteria have been fulfilled, right? And that's a very standard way to run a type 1 case. Maybe just 2 bits of advice about type 1 cases if you decide that you're going to run a type 1 case. The first thing is that it's often a helpful point to make to say that your solution is not just a good solution or an effective solution, but is the most effective solution, or at the very least, a uniquely effective solution. And again, this is because in a type 1 case, you are particularly susceptible to the other side saying, we could solve the problems you want to solve using a slightly different mechanism. And being very mechanistically specific helps to evade lots of these problems. The second piece of advice I like to sort of suggest is that, especially when it comes to what I suppose I would call sort of stereotypically soft debates. I think debates which are not about geopol or economics, but which might be about cultural dynamics or historical memory, these sorts of debates. When it comes to these very soft debates, the solution actually is to be very, very rigorous in the way you're going to explain the mechanism of your policy. So in a debate, for instance, about war memorials, any debate of war memorials, this house believes that war memorials should commemorate soldiers from both sides of the conflict. This house believes that war memorials should not contain religious symbols, that sort of stuff. I would really advise you taking time in prep to think about why war memorials matter and why they're important. Because if you're running a type 1 case, that becomes a key link in your argument. And if that link falls, then the rest of your case might as well not exist. So you might want to suggest things like, for instance, on a very pragmatic level, war memorials play a very significant role when it comes to educating people, right? I mean, little kids are brought on school excursions there. They see these things. They ask the teachers questions. Teachers can answer them. You could say that they play a very prominent role in the sort of symbolic construction of the state, right? Because they are sites where rituals of national identity are held. Leaders have to stand in front of them and say things about them. And if you change the content of what exists in a war memorial, maybe that changes the way in which leaders engage with them. Or thirdly, I suppose on a most generic level, you want to say they play a very prominent role in public consciousness, right? They are located in public spaces that are often designed in such a way as to invite a particularly reflective or reflexive or somber sort of mood. And so they play a role in helping people construct their historical idea of what the narrative of the state is, what the identity of the state is. And so enumerating the mechanisms and being very specific in this way actually helps to give very soft cases a lot of weight. And on a very pragmatic level, judges are probably more inclined to give you decent speaks if you do stuff like that. So that's my advice about type 1 cases. You need to defend every single link. Obviously, you focus on the more controversial ones. But the main thing I want to get across is really that don't worry if you only think you have one argument on your side. Very often, the fact that you have one argument on your side of the debate is a great thing for you because it means you have the opportunity to spend all your energy running one extremely tight case, which you can defend extremely well, extremely consistently, and you won't have to, bother with the mental effort of trying to juggle 4 or 5 points, which might be winning, some of which might be more or less important than the other. So type 1 cases actually have their own benefits, and people shouldn't be afraid of running them. So that's the first thing I want to say. So what about type 2 cases? Now, it's a lot harder to give advice on type 2 cases because, to be honest, it's quite rare that you are given the opportunity to run a type 2 case. But when you do run a type 2 case, the key thing strategically, which I would recommend, is to explicitly discuss in prep beforehand which of these arguments you really want to focus on, which of these arguments you're happy to lose, actually, if you believe that the remaining arguments will carry your case at the end of the day. And the reason I say this is because very often when teams are engaging in the rebuttal action in a debate, they choose to defend everything. Because they're convinced that all the arguments they're making are so good, they sort of end up spreading themselves too thin. And what happens often, and this is a real risk in a type 2 case, is that if you run 4 or 5 arguments and all of them are actually really good, if the other team just engages on 3 or even 4 of them, as long as they kind of make it murky enough on the issues which they do engage on, it's very likely, in fact, it might be probable that the judge will sort of lose sight of the fact that you had one other remaining winning argument which was not really tackled, and the other team ends up winning over you. I think it's just a basic psychological fact about how people see cases, right? If enough of the stuff you say falls, it kind of looks as if you're losing, even if the one thing which remains is winning. So in a type 2 case, it's perfectly fine. In fact, it's a sort of happy problem if you have too many winning arguments, but you still need to be very aware of which you want to prioritize and which you're willing to let go if you have to, right? So maybe you decide that arguments number 3, 4, and 5, even though they're really good, you're only running them just to ensure that your extension team can't really run them and claim credit, right? So maybe you just spend a couple of minutes on them. That's also a viable strategy. If you are a very experienced team and you are extremely concise in how you explain arguments, and if you have a second speaker who is very, very adept at extending previous material, maybe you want to defend every single argument which you're making, which you think is winning, right? Go for like a very ballsy, I want to get an 88 and win and just sort of squash the debate flat under the sheer volume of winning material I have sort of approach. You can do that, but I think in general, it really helps to have a lot of experience and to be extremely concise if you want to go for that approach. So that's my advice for a type 2 case. Now, type 1 and type 2 cases are just points on a spectrum, right? Most of the time, you'll be running cases which fall somewhere in between. So often, you will end up thinking, oh, actually, we have like 3 or 4 arguments. They're all reasonably decent, but only one is like a really winning one. So an example of a case like this probably is this house would pay reparations to the descendants of slaves. If you think about it carefully and strategically in prep, you should realize that the main argument in this debate is not actually a pragmatic one. Because if you are going to run pragmatic arguments about helping those who are poor or disenfranchised, the op is perfectly entitled to say that we will just make better welfare schemes. We'll have more welfare for the poor, and that covers most of the ground, the argumentative terrain you want to cover, if you're just focusing on poverty alleviation. So the test case really is, what do we do for a person who might be a descendant of a slave and actually does not require government welfare and is fairly well-to-do? And that argument about why such a person deserves significant reparations is an argument of a slightly more non-consequentialist or principled bent. It's an argument about why the state owes these duties to people who are descendants of slaves. And that, if you're going to focus on that argument, you really end up running a case which in some respects is very similar to a type 1. Because you might end up having, your first argument being, why is it that the state is responsible for the atrocities of the past? Argument number 2 is why the atrocities of the past connect to the present. Argument number 3 is why people today still continue to benefit from the atrocities in the past, and why therefore it's legitimate for a government to tax them and to give that money back to people who are descendants of slaves, right? But those 3 arguments really aren't separate arguments. They're just part of the standard argument for when the state owes reparative obligations to a particular community. But then on top of these 3 arguments, you might have another argument about the sort of maybe pragmatic political benefits or pragmatic economic benefits. And those arguments could be arguments number 4 and 5. So this is a kind of case which is a mixture between a type 1 and a type 2 case. And again, the key thing I want to point out is that if you're running a case like this, you need to be aware, or it really helps to be aware, that your case has this particular argumentative structure. That arguments number 1, 2, and 3 really need to be defended extremely rigorously and emphasized. And arguments number 4 and 5 could be things which extend your winning margin, right? And which are certainly helpful to run, which I would certainly run in a debate, but I don't think would end up being the main linchpin of your case. And so I think thinking in terms of what kind of a case I'm running, just the argumentative structure alone, helps you to decide in prep what kind of a strategy is the right strategy to run. And that gives you a frame with which to clarify some of the questions you might have in prep about which arguments you might want to run first, which arguments you want to defend if they have been attacked, and which arguments, if you are a whip and you're weighing up, you want to say are the most important or are the least important. And I think that just helps to clarify issues. So that's what I wanted to say about type 1 and type 2 cases. And if you've got any questions about this or it's unclear, please feel free to just shoot me a question and I'll try and answer them to the best of my ability. Okay, the second section of this lecture is dedicated to me just giving you like 4 basic psychological tips which will help you in prep and which I think will help you come up with cases which are strategically good. These are not tips about how to come up with good cases, tips about content. These are just psychological facts which I think will be helpful for us to recognize. The first thing I want to point out is that don't be afraid of creating a really large clash in the debate. In other words, don't be afraid of running an argument just because of the fact that the team on the other side has a very compelling response to it, or because of the fact that it will open up a very, very complex back and forth discussion about a particular argument and you're not 100% sure if you can win it. And the reason why this is very important is because if you don't dare to run cases where the clash is very explicit and very clear, you will never become really, really good at debating. Because the very best debates are debates where you both set up a very clear clash and a clash which is fair towards the other side, but you're still confident enough to win it in the ensuing back and forth anyway. Second thing I'd like to point out is that in prep, don't start talking immediately. And I mean this quite seriously. So very often when teams see emotion, the first reaction is to say, oh, we're screwed basically because we're an op and this is prop weighted. Or people will say things like, oh, I've done this before, I know what this is all about. Or because there's a long walk to the venue, you feel compelled to just start talking immediately. And I think that can often be very unwise. Because often, while first instincts can be very useful, as we'll be discussing later, very often the best ideas and often very like interesting nuances to your case or interesting contextualizations only come to you when you're not talking to someone else about what's going on. You should talk to your partner after you've started thinking about the case, but don't start talking straight away. Often it just ends up sending you to some horrible death spiral of panic, which really doesn't help your case at all. The third thing to point out, numbers aren't quality. One argument can win a debate. And you shouldn't be worried if you think it's only one key issue, because actually that can be benefit. Lastly, many arguments which you think are bad are probably actually quite good. I don't want to overstate this because you will think of some horrific arguments and make them. But very often arguments which you think are boring or trivial or unimpactful can be made to become a lot more important if you just spend time thinking about them and trying to frame them in a way which makes them important. And we'll be talking about that very, very shortly. So those are just 4 bits of purely psychological advice, right? So you have more confidence in what you come up with. And I think that just helps you, right? When you're actually running a case, if you believe what you're saying is winning, it just helps your manner very often. And manner is actually part of how BP debates are judged, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what you think. I have no position. So that is section 2 of this lecture. Section 3 is when I think we're going to talk about some practical frameworks or practical ideas about how to come up with strategically effective cases. The first thing I'd like to point out is that your common sense is almost always going to be right. And when I say common sense, I really do mean common sense. I mean, you need to stop thinking like a debater and ask yourself, if I had made this suggestion to a layperson on the street, if they were to react by saying, oh yeah, this is a great idea, why would they think it was a great idea? What would be their gut reaction to this? Or if they didn't think this was a great idea, what would their main concern be? What would their objection be? And very often when you adopt this method of thinking in prep, you will come to arguments which look to you trivial, uninteresting, bland, and totally without weight. But very often what you can do is that you can actually make these arguments good. You can make these arguments good by trying to wrap them in language or in framing or in a kind of philosophical context which gives them bite and force. So to go back to the example we're just talking about, right, which I mentioned briefly earlier, suppose you are opposing banning violent video games. Now, if you ask a layperson on the street why we shouldn't ban violent video games, the first thing they say is probably because, well, there's no reason to. I don't really think people commit violence because of them. But the second thing most people would say is that, well, people really enjoy playing violent video games, so we should probably just let them do it. Now, this second point, the way I've just said it, it looks extremely trivial and uninteresting. But if you think about it carefully in prep, and you have confidence that this can be a good point, you'll actually come to develop it in a more interesting direction. You might, for example, end up realizing that banning violent video games might actually constitute a kind of government-sanctioned identity-based discrimination. And you might make an argument along these lines. You might make an argument which says, we think that violence, atavism, territoriality, ritual, dominance, aggression, bloodlust, all of these are fundamental and intrinsic parts of human nature that we think we ought to celebrate. Now, obviously, in the real world, we can't really realize these parts of human nature that well because we cause direct third-party harm. But the great thing about the virtual world is that you can indulge these fantasies. You can be violent. If that's what gives you pleasure and that's what gives your life meaning, you can build your identity around violence or hyper-violence in the virtual world. And the government should not discriminate against people who make this lifestyle choice. And it doesn't matter if that lifestyle happens to be primarily realized in the virtual world, right? You still have a community, which supports you and recognizes that what you're pursuing is meaningful in the virtual world. You have goals which you can set for yourself. The sense of achievement and satisfaction you get when you realize them is every bit as real and genuine as people who have other goals in life, right? Or in the non-virtual world. So you might then want to say that governments really ought not to discriminate against lifestyle choices purely on the basis of governments being uncomfortable with the particular way which people have chosen to express themselves or their desires or their identity, right? And saying it that way, you make it sound like a much more powerful and interesting argument. But really, that argument, I believe, is no different from the gut instinct a person would have on the street when a person says, well, people enjoy them and they really find them meaningful. So let people play these violent video games, right? So that can be an example of how common sense leads you to arguments which you think aren't very good, but actually could be extremely effective. The second thing I like to point out, my second piece of advice, is that the very best arguments are usually arguments which work regardless of the context in which you're making them. And this is particularly relevant if you find yourself in a situation where you have been given a motion which can occur in such a huge variety of different and entirely legitimate contexts that many of the arguments which you will come up with end up presuming a certain very specific concatenation of affairs, which probably isn't even the majority of the relevant situations the motion calls you to discuss. So what would an example of such a motion be? Well, one example could be, this House believes that in post-conflict states, prominent members of groups which fought against the state should not be allowed to run for office. Now, this is one of these really nasty motions, because while I suppose in just purely intellectual terms, it's probably quite a fair debate, there's a real problem with, especially in proposition, trying to come up with arguments for it. Because for a start, the fact that you need to consider what happens if these people run and they win. You need to consider what happens if these people run and they lose. You need to consider the staggeringly vast array of different countries and different kinds of groups. Some of these groups might more legitimately be characterized as groups fighting against historical injustices or ongoing injustices. They might be more, your freedom fighters. Other groups might be more like ISIS, almost entirely devoid of legitimate aims. And you need to make arguments about both these kinds of groups, and that's tough. You might also need to consider the fact that sometimes these rebel groups, let's call them rebel groups, or anti-government groups, sometimes these groups might be an ethnic minority, in which case that has very significant implications for what happens if they run for office, or they might be the majority, which also then has implications for how you discuss the consequences if they win or lose or run for office, right? So it's a very tough debate, actually not for both sides, because many of your arguments will hinge, or many of the arguments which you will think of will hinge on one or, on one of these specific contexts being the relevant one. Now, in this scenario, it's often just very helpful to try and think of arguments which will work no matter what the context is. So for instance, on the opposition, you probably want to run a very strong argument to the effect of, we think that governments should not restrict the capacity of people to run for office. I suppose within some basic constitutional boundaries, you believe in an absolute right for people to, depending on how you frame it, an absolute right for people to either run for office, or you believe that people should have the broadest possible choice of representative leader, right? Each of these principles really gets you to the same outcome, but requires slightly different framing. And if you're going to argue, if you're going to make this principled argument on the opposition, you probably want to make an argument to the effect of, given that the state is such an inherently oppressive and tyrannical organism, given the vast, obscene power it has over the lives of average citizens, that power is always in want of a very good justification. And the only possible justification for this kind of state power, for the very existence of a state, needs to lie in the fact that the people gave the state the authority to use that power over them. But for the people to have legitimately given the state that authority, they must have had a legitimate choice over who they elected to constitute that state. And if states are going to restrict, prominent individuals in such a country from running for power, the state's not giving people real choice. And if there's no real choice, then there's no justification for state power, and that's not something you're willing to accept. So that will be, or at least for me, I want to run this argument really strongly on the opposition, probably spend at least 3 minutes on it, or maybe two to 3 minutes on it, because it's such a good argument, because it's so clear. No matter what the proposition says, no matter what the context is, this argument is going to be effective. And if it's true, we win the debate almost by default. And I suppose, But I don't want to give you the impression that many of these arguments which work regardless of context are quote-unquote principal arguments, because very often practical arguments are like that. Practical arguments are like that as well. So for instance, on the proposition, I would probably make most of my arguments in the first speaker, not so much about what happens if these people either win or lose an election, though I think that's very important. I'll make most of my arguments about how the democratic campaign itself is going to be run. You know, how are your political opponents going to besmirch you? Are we going to get a proper discussion of concrete issues at all, or are we going to get the reopening of wounds of tribalism and a rapid race to the bottom, and a particularly noxious and toxic kind of identity politics, which is not conducive to the formation of a stable democracy in the long run? And the great thing about focusing on the campaign itself is that I don't need to think so much about what the consequences are if a person wins or loses. I could have another set of arguments about that, but I know that this argument works regardless of that particular context. Now, obviously, if I was discussing these campaigns, I would need to consider differences in how these campaigns would be run if the person who was running was of a minority group versus a majority group. So I can't altogether run away from a certain degree of contextualizing and tethering my arguments to specific circumstances, but I've definitely made my job a lot easier. And this is also relevant for extension speakers, because if you think about it, if your opening government goes straight for arguments about why it's bad if they win and why it's bad if they lose, that gives you a really nice window for you to come in and sound like a smart ally, right? To say, you know, we've had a lot of discussion on what happens if they win, and how these people will be horrific leaders because they're habituated into, you know, very hierarchical organizational structures, because they're not used to listening to dissent, because they're used to a lack of transparency in the leadership style. If the opening government talks a lot about that, the wonderful thing about you as extension is that you know that you can come and say, well, Madam Chair, I think that was all very nice analysis, but that was analysis which required for a very specific outcome to occur. I want to make an argument for you today, which is going to work regardless of the outcome of that election, which is always going to have to be true. And that's why I think this argument has more weight in this debate than what the opening talked about. And then you put yourself in a very good position as an extension, as a team in the closing half, to win the debate. So I think that's my second piece of advice. Try to think of arguments which work well despite of context. And do keep in mind that many of these arguments will be practical ones as well. So third piece of advice. Sometimes in a debate like this, you can't really think of one argument that covers all the necessary strategic terrain. So what you are left with really is a huge spectrum or a huge variety of cases, and you need to do something with them. There are three standard ways to deal with a spectrum of cases. The first one is almost a sort of a fortiori tactic. Basically what you do is that you deliberately go and argue in the case which is the very worst for you. And what you then say is that given that we win, that our argument wins for us, even in this context, where our case is the very weakest, given that it wins there, we probably win in every other context as well. Now, sometimes you're sort of forced to do this when your burden in a debate is absolute. So for instance, if the debate is something along the lines of this house believes that, I don't know, like, this house believes that indigenous people should always be able to raise an absolute defense of cultural practice in response to all crimes. Well, that's an absolute debate, right? So that debate really isn't about things like polygamy. It's really probably going to be things like FGM and why we should allow people to not be punished for practicing FGM. And you're sort of forced to debate those cases because really any good opposition is going to concede that maybe we should just legalize polygamy for everyone. Why is it that things like FGM should be things which people have an absolute right to, should have an absolute defense for if they are prosecuted for it? So sometimes you're forced to debate in the worst case almost because of the motion, the nature of the motion. But very often the motion will not be absolute and give you a certain degree of leeway. And in those cases, you have the option available of running an argument in the most extreme case. An example of this would be a debate which involves let's say this House would ban race-based parties from running for political office or for fielding candidates in elections. Now, it's a perfectly legitimate opt to say that we think that there are many good race-based parties fighting for racial equality, but I also think it wouldn't be absurd at all for an opt to say, we think that even bad racist parties ought to have a voice because they express important issues which need to be discussed, even if the language with which they bring these issues up is absolutely abhorrent. And we think that banning these parties is probably going to do more harm than good to begin with because of, I don't know, all kinds of political effects, which you're probably quite comfortable explaining. And again, if you can prove that even these bad race-based parties should be allowed to run for power, or quote-unquote bad race-based parties, you probably win the debate because then the arguments of why good race-based parties should be allowed to run for power look trivial by comparison. And again, this is useful for extension, right? So if your opening has debated in the easy case, you always have the option available in closing of going for the hard case, biting the bullet and saying, we are going to prove that even in these circumstances, we win. And then you can try and frame that to make it look as if then your argument, because it's more principled, it's more consistent, because it's more deep, is more important than the argument which the opening has talked about. That's one way you can deal with a spectrum of cases. The other way you can deal with a spectrum of cases is to divide and conquer. So break a spectrum down into different sections, give me a reasonable characterization of each of these I suppose you could call them each of these groups, each of these circumstances, and tell me why you have a unique set of arguments which works in each of these cases. An example of such a case might be, for instance, this House would criminalize the payment of ransom. So one of the contexts, if you're in opposition, one of the contexts in which you may want to debate is as it were, the stereotypical, but nowadays not very common context where a child is kidnapped and some kind of criminal organization, maybe a drug mafia, for instance, maybe a drug gang or a criminal mafia, blackmails the family for money. And in that case, you want to say it's unfair to punish the parents because any parent in this circumstance would almost certainly opt to save the child instead of go to the police and report the fact that the child has been kidnapped. You could also make a principled argument about the fact that this is moral luck. Given that any possible parent would have done this, the parents who have been unlucky enough to have the child kidnapped are sort of being almost subject to double punishment here. Not only are they having to suffer the agony of the child being kidnapped, now they're also being punished for doing what anyone else in society would do. So it's unfair to them because singling these parents out in specific for criminal sanction says in some way that they are morally deficient human beings when really they're not. They're doing what anyone else would have done, so it's really arbitrary that they are getting punished. Maybe that's one context in which you can run a very good set of arguments. But if you're a bit more aware of how kidnapping or payment of ransom tends to happen in the real world nowadays, you might want to run an argument about why it's okay for Somali pirates to hijack large oil tankers and demand payment from them. You might want to run a principled argument about how this is no different, functionally, from states imposing tax on ships which pass through their waters. After all, we are threatening certain large companies with violence unless they give us a certain amount of money, which really ultimately is what states do when they tax people. You might want to say that given the states here are weak and practically non-existent, these piracy might really be a kind of proxy for an effective state system of taxation. You might want to talk about how many of these companies have ransom insurance. So really, they don't suffer that much damage from having to pay out this money. And because they've got insurance, they're not really paying out unpredictable large sums. They're really paying another company regular fixed sums, much like tax, in order to bear that large burden. Although actually that's not how ransom insurance works, but it doesn't really matter. This is just how you might want to look into different scenarios and make different arguments, right? Another scenario, again, for the payment of ransom might be war journalism, right? Very often, journalists are opportunistically kidnapped by terrorist groups so they can make a quick buck from, whatever organization these journalists work for. But you can make an argument which says, if we don't pay ransom, we get fewer journalists in the field going to report on horrific crimes. And that means that there's less global awareness, and that means the very complicated process of dealing with these atrocities starts a lot later, and that is bad. So again, right, on the op, these three very different contexts, which allow you to make very different arguments, all of which are very effective. And there's nothing wrong in a debate like this of just breaking up these cases, breaking up these contexts and having specific arguments to deal with each of them, right? Standard kidnapping, piracy, and war reporting. So that's the second way in which you can deal with a spectrum or a variety of cases. The third thing you can do, I think this is probably what most debaters do, because it's certainly the easiest one to do, and it's often reasonably effective, though it's often not done particularly well, is to look at a spectrum and break it up. But instead of doing what I just suggested, which is that you make separate arguments about each of these groups, you say that really we think only one of these contexts or a particular area along this spectrum actually matters. So this is very common in arguments about backlash, right? So people will say, oh, the people on the far right and the far left are obviously not going to be affected by what the government does. By the way, people who are sitting on the fence, and government action of this sort might, I don't know, depending on what you want to say, might paint the feminist movement as a bunch of man-haters, right? And these are the people who probably agree in abstract that equality is good, but think in some vague sense that feminism has gone too far. And these are the people we need to cater to, because they're the ones whose support we need for political causes to be effectively fought for. And if we alienate them, things go wrong. So this is another, this is, as it were, I think almost a default for most teams when they're trying to deal with a spectrum of cases like that. And the reason why I think it's just helpful in terms of strategy to be aware of these three methods of dealing with a spectrum is because very often when you run through this little list, you will find that what you would have originally thought intuitively was the right way of breaking down these cases might not have been the best, and something else is actually some other tactics open to you. The other basic thing is that whenever you're dealing with a spectrum of cases, you need to acknowledge that complexity. I think judges generally appreciate it when you clarify and acknowledge, we clarify the debate by acknowledging its complexity, but then giving the judge a way to deal with that complexity in a way which is logical and coherent and helps the other arguments in the debate get slotted into some kind of straightforward adjudicative framework. Generally, if you make the judge's life easy, you get higher speak. So I see no reason to do otherwise. One last thing I want to point out about the final method of dealing with a spectrum. The reason why I said that very often people don't do a very good job at it is because they don't often prove that the one area of the spectrum they want to discuss really is on that relevant tipping point. Because in order to show that this particular group of people will be affected by this policy, you need to show plausibly, psychologically for these actors, why in their minds, the arguments on both sides are finely balanced. And so what eventually tips them one way or another is going to be the action which the motion demands that you either undertake or you oppose. An example would be, for instance, okay, let's take a classic debate. This House would pay dictators to step down from power. Now, if we apply the first bit of the first recommendation I gave you, which is just to be commonsensical, on opposition, really the main argument is dictators are bastards, so they shouldn't be given money for being bastards. That's your gut reaction. You probably finesse this argument eventually into something which says that this might encourage more dictatorships, right? Which sounds like an absurd thing to say, because if you think about it, like when people decide to become dictators, if they even decide to become dictators in the straightforward fashion, they don't really go, oh, I wonder if I'll be hauled before the ICC. Because by and large, the ICC is not that effective. And because by and large, being hauled to the ICC is such a distant event on the horizon, you don't really consider it. So how are you going to make an argument about how this might encourage more dictatorships, right? Well, you probably then want to paint a very nuanced and detailed picture about exactly how dictatorships form. And actually, most dictatorships form out of weak democracies, where certain actors within the government over time decide that democracy is too complicated or too ineffective, or they just want to enrich themselves if it's a typical kleptocratic dictatorship. And in these sorts of scenarios, when it's a gradual process, the knowledge that you might be granted immunity at the end of that process of transitioning out from democracy into a dictatorship might actually be a significant factor in the political machinations of the powers that be that allow for weak democracies to collapse into dictatorships, right? Because, to the mind of a dictator, the personal risk which they're going to suffer might actually play a significant role when they're deciding what to do in these sorts of contexts. So giving me detail about that context, or giving the judge detail about that context is really important to making this particular strategy work. Okay, so that's the third piece of practical advice. The fourth bit of practical advice, and this is my last bit of practical advice, is that it really, really, really helps to be specific, or at least consider being very specific to the peculiar demands of the motion when you're trying to think of arguments. The reason being that if you run a set of, a generic set of arguments, your extension really is given a lot of space to run a much more specific set of arguments and to tell the judge that they're the only one to actually bother to engage the words of the motion, right? And whether or not that makes the arguments actually more or less impactful, it's just psychologically effective often for making the extension look good. Second thing is, if you don't run a very specific set of arguments, you give the opposition too much to say. Let me give you an example of this. If you are proposing in a debate and the motion is, this House regrets organized religion, you could run a set of arguments, because again, this is probably one of these debates which is a classic type 2 debate, right? There's probably at least 5 or 6 really good arguments on the prop. The thing is, if you think about it, many of these arguments on the prop, which could be winning, imply that religion in general is bad. That belief in a God is irrational, that religion is inherently brainwashy or whatever. If you think about it, that makes it easier for your opposition, because it means that your opposition can run a set of arguments which says that actually we think religion is good or isn't that irrational, and they will still be engaging very directly with a lot of material that you're bringing up, right? So it's a very good idea in a debate like this, or at least it's certainly something which I would do, is that I would say that we on the opening government, we believe that religion is great. We celebrate religion. We think it gives people's lives meaning. We're happy to debate on the presumption that maybe there is a God, right? And that's fine. What we want to say is that actually organized religion damages the good which religion can do. Organized religion actually undermines the true meaning and benefit of a religion, right? Maybe it's through, a profusion of artificial doctrines designed primarily to solidify very human power structures and to give people access to some kind of divine truth. It could be through the proliferation of meaningless rituals. It could be through how organizations inherently are conservative because they need to sell a message which differs from what contemporary secular society sells in order to remain different and to justify their existence. And all these things really take away from the good which religion could do in the world. Now, this is strategically useful because it means that the opposition now needs to engage with my arguments very specifically about organization and its virtues. But it also means that the closing government team can't run an extension which says that religion is bad, because I very explicitly said that the stance on the proposition is that we think religion is great and we'd like to maximize its benefits to people. And so having a very specific case often allows you to fight a battle on 2 fronts, against your extension and against the opposing team, because you're forcing them to engage with you in a very narrow set of arguments which you can defend very well and which you can really, make ironclad in your prep. And, I'm not saying do this all the time. Like, very often in debates, the best arguments are general arguments. Arguments about principles, for instance, which might apply in many situations beyond the specific one which the debate asks you to discuss. But it's still very, very helpful to try and make your arguments as specific as possible. In fact, I would say that probably is a general rule. Don't try and run generic arguments, try and make them specific to what the motion demands. Okay, so that is all I've got to say. Just a very brief recap. So the first thing we talked about was, type 1 and type 2 cases, where it really helps to be aware of what the relationship between your different arguments are. Are your different arguments really part of one bigger argument so that you need to defend all of them? Or do you have multiple winning arguments? Or do you have something in between? And depending on what kind of case you're running, you need to design your strategy differently. You need to allocate different amounts of time. You need to explicitly talk to your partner about how you want to defend or drop certain arguments. The second thing we talked about in this lecture was just some basic psychological tips. Don't be afraid of clashes. Don't start talking straight away. Don't care about the numbers. And have confidence in what you come up with, because often it's better than you think. Lastly, just 4 basic tips for how you try and deal with some quite common strategical dilemmas you might face. Number 1, how do you locate the clash in a debate? Use your common sense. Common sense is almost always correct. Second, if you are facing a debate which occurs across a vast number of contexts, try and make arguments which work regardless of context. Thirdly, sometimes if you again face up a spectrum, you have these 3 standard strategic options open to you to deal with them. And lastly, try and make your arguments specific to the peculiar thing which the debate is asking you to discuss, because that will often help you fight a debate on 2 fronts, against your extension and against the team immediately opposite you. So, okay, I hope this was vaguely helpful. And if you think this is nonsense, feel free to tell me in the comments. I might read them at some point, or someone might point them out to me. And yeah, good luck for Euros, and I hope this helped. Cheers.